What exactly is the federal funds rate? Why should we care as realtors? How does it impact inflation? And ultimately, how does it impact the 30-year fixed mortgage? It's Peter Chabris with Lockbox, where we provide realtors lessons in leads, listings, and leadership. And I'm going to explain right away what is the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is the rate that banks lend money to each other overnight. It's determined by the FOMC, which is an arm or it's a kind of like a committee within the Federal Reserve as part of the country's monetary policy. So simply said, it's the federal government's rate that they set on what interest rate banks can lend money back and forth. Commercial banks can lend money to each other overnight. So that's all it is. So how does it impact inflation, right? We've been going through this period of acute inflation. We've been seeing the Federal Reserve, every time it meets, 8 times per year, it's increasing that federal funds rate, the rate at which banks can lend money back and forth. Why do they do that? Well, inflation is a result of an overheated economy, right? It's getting too hot. And so the federal government, through its monetary policy, wants to cool things down. What they do is they increase the federal funds rate, the rate that banks can lend money back and forth to each other. Well, if the bank used to lend money at 0% and now they have to lend money at 5%, they still have to make profit. And so they add a couple interest points on top of that, and that's where their margin comes from. Any business that requires credit, things like borrowing money for a car, your credit card bills, as it becomes more expensive, consumers and businesses both tamp down their consumption because it becomes more expensive to do the same things. And that's ultimately how the Fed brings down inflation, by increasing its federal funds rate. Okay, great. So now the question is, and that's how they use it to control inflation. The last thing is, does this really impact mortgages? The answer is yes and no. The federal funds rate is a short-term rate that banks lend money back and forth to, but what happens over time is, as those rates increase, it kind of propagates into long-term interest rates as well, right? Because it makes sense. If credit becomes more expensive in the short term, it starts to become more expensive in the long term. 30-year mortgages are calculated most by the 10-year Treasury bond. As the 10-year Treasury bond moves up, so too do 30-year mortgage rates. As the federal funds rate increases and stays at a higher rate, the long-term impact is that longer-term debt instruments, like the 10-year Treasury bond, also increase. And so there is an indirect correlation between short-term increases in the federal funds rate, 10-year T-bills, and ultimately the 30-year fixed mortgage. So now the next time you're hanging out with a consumer and another realtor, you can explain what the federal funds rate is, how it's used to control inflation, and how it indirectly impacts mortgage rates. Congratulations, you got an A on your economics today. I'll see you in a week.